So after the year we've had, it's pretty safe to say that this Christmas is a little bit different than usual. Where usually it would be a time of bringing people together in peace and love, uniting them under a common goal of goodwill to all, this year, due to circumstances where generally we would have gathered, we're apart. Or at least it's looking that way at this point in time. I'm actually writing and recording this script in June. It's 20 degrees Celsius regularly and my hair's grown so long that I actually can't remember what a barber's shop looks like anymore. The point is, at the time when we should most be gathering, we've been told to keep away. And that sucks. It really does. That's why today we're going to be taking a look at 1994's The Story of Christmas, a 50-minute animated Christian film that was broadcast on French television before being roughly translated and dumped on VHS in the UK and US. While the title would imply that this was going to be a somewhat more festive arrangement, to me it instills visions of handmade stop motion like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, it would probably be more accurate to title this The Story of Jesus Part 1, because that's basically what this is. Now, I'm not exactly sure about the US, but here in the UK, the Nativity is a big part of our childhood schooling experience. It's such a staple of growing up in this country that 4 entire comedy films have been released purely around the curation and direction of these plays and the children who are involved in them. It's a big deal at this time of year. But depending on the school, there are a hell of a lot of variations in terms of where the play stops, where it starts, and the context around how it's framed. I'm sure that most people know the plot of the traditional nativity play, but for those of us who either didn't go to a Christian-oriented school, or even just the less religious amongst us, the play tells the story of the birth of Jesus. It opens with a census being called across the Middle East and for everyone to return to their ancestral place of birth in order to register for tax. Mary and Joseph are both from Bethlehem, so they need to go back there. However, Mary is pregnant with the Son of God. Most plays will narrate these bits and open with Mary and Joseph riding their donkey into Bethlehem, with Mary being on the verge of giving birth. The couple arrive in the city only to find that all of the inns are full, and while pleading mercy with a local innkeeper, they're finally allowed to stop in his stables until the morning. That night, Mary gives birth to Jesus in the stables, and shortly thereafter, some shepherds, 3 wise men and 3 kings arrive at the stables to deliver gifts, as was foretold in a prophecy. And usually, the play ends there. What 80% of schools don't get into is what happens after the birth, and this is where shit really gets interesting. So after all the good stuff that's happened, we're then introduced to King Herod. Herod's heard that a child has just been born who'll remove him from power and take his place as the King of Kings. And he's pissed off. How pissed off? He orders the execution of all recently born sons within the city he rules over. And Herod's armies obey, as in, they immediately head into the city and straight up murder a crap ton of babies. Mary and Joseph are visited by an angel who warns them to flee, and so they do so by heading up to the mountains, where they're followed by soldiers. After a while, they finally manage to make their way to Egypt, where they lie low until Herod conveniently dies, and then they just return home and raise Jesus into the righteous dude he's known to be. Now, I went to a good old-fashioned God-fearing school as a child, so we were taught about that extra bit of the Nativity. It was also heavily pushed that it was God who murdered Herod for his baby-killing atrocities. But I was surprised to learn in later life that most schools rarely, if ever, taught that part of the story to kids. It's arguably one of the more action-packed parts of the Bible. But anyway, the reason I've gone into detail here is because that's basically the plot of The Story of Christmas. It's literally beat for beat everything from Mary and Joseph arriving in Bethlehem to Herod dying, but with one slightly unique twist. The entire movie is shown from the perspective of an old donkey. So around the time that Mary and Joseph arrive in Bethlehem, in this version they don't have a donkey, we then cut to the innkeeper who'll let Mary and Joseph stop in his stable, and he's just bought a bull. The bull's a bit thick, in the sense that he acts before he thinks, But when the bull arrives at the stables, we're introduced to our main protagonist for the movie, the old donkey. He's an old donkey. That's his character trait. He just constantly gets told he's really old, and he constantly complains about how little he can do because he's so old. The bull and the donkey butt heads for a bit, and it's implied that if the old donkey doesn't pull his weight around the place more, he'll be given the axe. When Mary and Joseph arrive, the nativity happens as normal, but the next day the innkeeper decides enough is enough and takes the old donkey into town to try and sell him. When he can't get a price for him, he instead sells him to the mill as a pack mule to help turn the mill grinder. But the old donkey doesn't want to spend the rest of his life doing that, so he breaks out. It's here that he overhears about the plan to kill all firstborn sons, and then he decides to go and warn the people at the stable about the impending fate of the baby Jesus. And basically, from there, that's pretty much the rest of this movie. Mary and Joseph are contacted by an angel and told they need to leave because of King Herod's order. They ask the innkeeper if they can take the old donkey along with them to carry their belongings, and sometimes Mary, which, well, the innkeeper gets left a ton of gold, frankincense and myrrh, so of course he obliges. And from there it's basically, the old donkey travels with Mary and Joseph, gets captured, overhears something about Herod's plan, escapes, and then meets back up with Mary and Joseph and helps steer them out of trouble. Along the way, he eventually meets a really young donkey being attacked by a Roman soldier, and after attacking the soldier, the two donkeys travel together with Mary and Joseph for the rest of the movie. Then the plot changes slightly to the young donkey gets captured, overhears something about Herod's plan, the old donkey rescues the young donkey, and together they both help steer Mary and Joseph out of trouble. It's all a bit by the numbers, and being honest, it's all deeply underwhelming. I assume the reason this film exists is because of how few schools actually teach that part of the story of the birth of Jesus. Because while the birth is in this film, it's only about 10 to 15 minutes of the full runtime. The rest is purely all on the story of Herod. And while I'm not going to get into the believability of the plot, because religious flame wars are not something I want raging in the comments, I will say this is clearly made for very young children, and if I had to hazard a guess, I'd think this would mainly be used by churches during Sunday school services around Christmas time to help keep the kids quiet and deal with a very difficult part of the Bible that needs to be touched on delicately with young children. The idea to use animals as the protagonists in this is a pretty reasonable way to deal with this part of the story, as I think had it been all human driven, it might have got a little bit heavy for its intended audience. But what doesn't help matters is that all of the animals, well, they're just pretty boring or annoying. The bull is pretty much a one-note joke that isn't funny the first time and certainly isn't any better the 100th time. The young donkey is totally irritating. Seriously, he gives off real Scrappy-Doo vibes in this picture. And our main protagonist, the old donkey, literally only exists to complain about how old he is and to be faux wise towards the other animals. The lack of any kind of interesting characters in this just makes it a total snore fest. This is a particularly dark part of the Bible, so taking a lighter contextual approach would have helped a bit to make it a bit more accessible. The problem is, showing this dark time from a lighter perspective kind of diminishes the brutality of the events, which I think causes this movie to stray away from what it's actually trying to say and show with the picture. One thing I will say about this movie is the pacing is just awful. It's a 50-minute movie that feels like a 90-minute movie. It's basically 40 minutes of animation of people walking and a donkey kicking things, intercut with 10 minutes of flashbacks to earlier portions of the film featuring walking or kicking things. That's how bad this film gets. It actually flashes back to footage earlier in the film because the film knows its audience will have grown so bored at this point that they'll need to be reminded of the boring bits they got too bored to watch in the beginning. The trouble with this movie is that the plot itself would make a pretty solid 25-minute special. At a push, it could maybe get to 35 if it had a solid script behind it. But 50 minutes for this plot feels a bit like what they did to the Hobbit movies. It's just total overkill. And as such, the film is so padded it's almost unreal. I went into this thinking it would at least have a reasonable chance to be good because it was under an hour and in the right hands it could have maybe been a pretty reasonable watch. But there's just Nothing here to get enthused about. It's incredibly dry, and the bits where there are any comedic value are defanged so heavily because of how young the target audience is that it makes it almost impossible to not start clock watching. Personally, I think the biggest problem this script had was that it blew its load way too early and then didn't really have anything else of equal or greater measure to throw out there. The birth of Jesus and the kings, shepherds and wise men turning up is a pretty solid ending for the story of the birth of Jesus in a nutshell. But this film more or less opens with that and then spends the next 40 minutes expanding on what is effectively an epilogue. They could have made a big deal about Herod's death, made it a grand and satisfying finale, but they don't even do that. He dies off screen, at which point everyone just sort of goes, "Oh, alright then." And that's it. The lack of any kind of building tension, scaled expectations, or a satisfying resolution totally hobbles this film and makes it pretty much a totally bland watch from a script perspective. This short was originally a French production written by Jean-François Laguioni and Alain Royer. Jean has 14 writing credits, most of them I'm told are relatively well received in France. Of note are Gwen, the Book of Sand and Louis by the Shore. For Alain, this is their only writing credit. As far as I can tell, they haven't really done anything else. The film was picked up for distribution in the UK and was localised by writers Michael Adams and Stephen Lyons, and collectively the pair have 3 writing credits between them. This is Stephen's only credit, and Michael's biggest credit is probably that he did the localisation for the US version of Raymond Briggs' classic Father Christmas. As I don't speak French, I can't really comment on how well the localisation has been done, but what I can say is that it's all very simplistic dialogue in the UK version, with very few complex words. So my guess is it probably would be a fairly accurate translation from the French version, as such simple sentences are kinda hard to mess up on. The director of this movie was Henry Heidzijk. Henry was mainly a TV director. He has 12 credits, but almost half of them are for Santa or Christmas-based TV specials or movies. The rest are largely for shorts. So while he hasn't exactly covered a ton of ground, there's at least some experience here. The art direction in this film isn't too terrible. That's not to say by any measure that it's good. It's a terrifically problematic work in all honesty. But I have seen worse. Shots of the desert and of various cities and towns used during the establishing shots are nice and kinda have receding detail about them, where the further back into the shot you look, the less detail there is, which in turn makes them look a little bit more realistic scaling wise. Shots of the inside of houses are fairly sparse, but there is detail where it's needed. I don't personally think it's the worst I've ever seen, but it's definitely below average. What's really awful about the art direction here are the technical choices used. For example, the art style itself I really like. It's kind of got a minimalist, rounded style with a real emphasis on smoothness. And as stills, these pieces can at times be beautiful. But when it comes to animating these elements, they've taken the frankly bizarre choice to animate the sequences at around 12 to 14 frames per second. Leading to super rough, jaggedy movements whenever anything moves or talks in this thing. It's painful to watch in places because I think with just a few more frames per second put back in to get it closer to the 24 to 25 standard, it would look so nice and smooth. As it stands, it looks like a draft. Something you'd send to an animation company as proof of concept for a commission. Equally painful is the amount of animation recycling they choose to do here. There's tons of little moments through this special where you can clearly see full and partially recycled animated loops. And the most notable one for me is the merchant who's working with the needle and thread. His sewing animation is recycled at least 2 or 3 times and it's super noticeable. There's a pipe player as well who has his body animation recycled into 2 or 3 different characters throughout as well. So while I kinda dig the art style, there's just so many bad decisions through this whole thing that it just totally kills any enjoyment I could have had in watching this. The vocal performances here too are nothing short of just abysmal. No one emotes in this. The best you get is the occasional character shouting, but even their shouting is just monotone. And putting on a funny voice doesn't count as emoting. Seriously, there's apparently half a dozen voice actors at least involved in this production, but because their performances are all so awful, it sounds like there's at most 3. There isn't one good performance here. It's all bland, monotone, adrift crap, and I hated it. In fact, apart from kind of digging the art style in this, the only other thing I kinda liked was the soundtrack, which was a semi-electronic Middle Eastern-inspired construction that was competent. It was used quite well in places where it needed to be utilised in, and for the most part it kinda gave the movie a bit of distinctness. It's no masterpiece, but at this point I'm clinging to what I can get in terms of acceptable traits of cinema. And the OST is about as acceptable as it's possible to get. The Story of Christmas was released on VHS in November 1994 by Contender Limited. It was for a time exclusively sold in Boots, a beauty shop in the UK. Whether it had a wider release outside of those stores, I can't say. It has no Amazon information, so it would seemingly be the case that Boots was the only outlet. And since then it's never had a re-release in the UK. But honestly, after sitting through this, I can easily see why. The Story of Christmas is a terrible attempt to introduce young children to the extended story of the birth of Jesus. It's just a series of bad decisions compressing on each other, stifling every aspect of this film until it collapses from suffocation. From showing the birth about a quarter of the way in, to shying away from the elements of the Herod story that are actually interesting, through to even basic technical decisions like how the cast performed and the frame rate levels. The whole thing is just a messy, incoherent, rambly mess that starts nowhere and ends in the most dissatisfying fizzle out that I've sat through in at least 6 months. Don't bother with this one. It's not even so bad it's good. It's just a disappointing, padded waste of time, and this will be finding its way into a nearby bin at the next convenience.